Welcome back to Deconstructing Directing. I'm Andrew Robler, the founder and archivist here. We are continuing to explore Act 2, our directing identity. Scene 1 explored the importance of having a why as a director and looked at some ways we can define our why. Scene 2 examined imposter syndrome in the context of directing, and Scene 3 challenged us to carefully consider our role models and the roles they model as we learn to differentiate ourselves as directors. Now, in Scene 4, we're going to turn our focus inward and explore where our strength as directors and artists comes from, how our lived experiences can and do impact our work as directors. So, let's start by addressing the elephant in the room. In many parts of the US, using a word like identity can bring with it a lot of baggage. In the 1970s, the term identity politics became a placeholder for the idea that someone was placing undue emphasis on one or more of their identities as a driving force behind their political choices, such as organizing, voting, and more. Now it's used almost exclusively in a negative sense, often as a way of saying that someone doesn't have any other reason to be for or against something besides the fact that they identify a particular way. So let's start by using our first facilitation skill from Act 1 and get specific about what we mean when we talk about identity. The Oxford Dictionary has two definitions for the noun identity. First, it's defined as the fact of being, or who or what a person or thing is. The second is a close similarity or affinity. Now that feels a little stiff, so let's rephrase slightly. Identity is made up of two parts, the immutable parts of who we are and didn't choose, and also the things we feel connected to. Human beings love to categorize things. It's something that our brains are particularly good at doing. In that sense, the first definition of identity seems straightforward. We look at something and define its identity by what it actually is. A tomato, for instance, is savory in flavor and eaten with other vegetables, so we put it in the category called vegetables. Except that a tomato actually fits the category called fruit because of the way it reproduces with seeds. This is just one example of how, depending on what specific fact of being of a person or thing we are focusing on, the way that we categorize them might change. This becomes even more complicated when we look at that second definition and realize that sentient beings like humans can communicate to others the things that they see are similar or related to them in various ways. For instance, I'm a theater nerd, an identity that could be argued to be based in my fact of being. However, it's not something that people would necessarily be able to know about me without knowing my affinity for the field of theater. Not surprisingly, as directors, we work with the idea of identity all the time when we coach actors through character development and scene work. How a character sees themselves is often deeply important to the structure of a story we are trying to tell, and in a narrative context, it's easier to set aside our real-world baggage around the world identity and talk about it. For this reason, learning how to better understand our own identities and how they have shaped and will continue to shape us as artists will make us stronger art directors artistically as well, like many of the skills we're discussing throughout Deconstructing Directing. The first step in understanding our identities and how they impact our work as directors is to understand which identities we possess. Linked below is a handout with a few different identity wheels that divide and organize categories of identity in different ways. However, the goal of each wheel is the same, to give us an opportunity to think about the myriad of identities that each of us possesses. On the one labeled social identity wheel, for instance, they divide our identities into three categories: internal identities, social identities, and relationship or role identities. The first category encompasses the values and beliefs that help us to understand who we are to ourselves. The second category encompasses all of the identities that we define based on how we relate to society as a whole. And the third category is made up of the types of relationships or roles that we identify with. Depending on your lived experience, this may or may not be the first time you've had to think in detail about all of your different identities. As someone who was assigned male at birth and grew up white and middle class, my identities often felt like the default for society. I never really had to think about how I related to the world around me through those identities because society was built with my particular identities in mind. When our identities are the default, we hold power and privilege. However, when I started going through my coming out process, that changed. All of a sudden, there was a part of me that I was painfully aware was not accepted by many parts of the society I had grown up in, and I began having to decide when to share that part of my identity or when I needed to keep it quiet. I had privilege in that this was a part of my identity I could choose to hide. That's not possible for everyone. Perhaps you, like me, have some identities that are assumed as the default in certain contexts, and some that you are very aware are not. Perhaps more of your identities fall into the former or the latter categories. Regardless, we can all benefit from taking the time to understand the many ways in which we identify. Not all of these identities will be important in creating theater. For instance, I love to cook, but it's not an identity that comes up much as a director. But understanding our identities more holistically helps us to become more self-aware as directors and leaders. The identity identification worksheet below gives you a starting point for this exploration, using the wheels in that first handout. Okay, so once we have a fuller picture of identities, what do we do with them moving forward? Why do they matter to us as directors? The reality is that our identities shape our perspective as directors, both in general and as it relates to a particular story we might be telling. For instance, as I've been writing this scene, I've been directing a 10-minute play that involves a non-binary character. As a non-binary person myself, my approach to this story is necessarily different than it would be if it were being directed by someone who identifies with the gender they were assigned at birth. This is not to say that someone like that couldn't or shouldn't direct this piece, but their lived experiences and identity would mean that they would connect with the material in a different way. Think of it like cooking a dish heavily tied to a particular culture, say a type of stew. If it's a dish we grew up with and whose making has been passed down from generation to generation, our relationship with the dish will be different, and we will likely understand nuances that we couldn't if our first time cooking that same dish were from a recipe printed in a cookbook or food blog. And when that stew has ingredients or techniques that could really mess up the final dish if used incorrectly, an inexperienced cook might ruin dinner for everyone if they're not careful. Turns out that my culinary identity comes in handy for theater after all. Ultimately, if you take nothing else away from this scene, I hope you take away the understanding that who you are and the life you have lived matters to your work as a director, regardless of your identities or lived experience. We all feel pressure to conform to the defaults of society, even those of us who have more identities that fit those defaults. So we often remake ourselves to fit the ideal of a particular role or task, when often the more powerful, if difficult, choice is to embrace what makes us who we are. If you're not a Patreon member and want to be, you can earn fun perks like stickers, monthly hangouts, and Q&A sessions with me, and more for helping to support this project financially. But none of this content will ever live behind a paywall, so if you can't or don't want to join the Patreon, don't worry, you'll still get all of Deconstructing Directing completely free. I'll see you again when you're ready to dive into Act 2, Scene 5, Developing Taste and Perspective. Until then, my fellow storytellers, I challenge us all to be recklessly kind.